It is the morning of March 4th, 1869. There's a light morning rain that's giving way to afternoon sunshine. By the time that the new President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, steps up to the east portico of the U.S. Capitol. His inaugural address that day was less than 8 minutes long, and it caused some unexpected surprise among the crowd. As Grant reached the topic of Indian affairs in his address, his words actually distressed many former Army comrades and uplifted those humanitarian reformers that I spoke about in the last lecture. He said, and I quote, "The proper treatment of the original occupants of this land, the Indians, is one deserving of careful study. I will favor any course toward them which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship." Now, Lieutenant General William Tecumseh Sherman, whom Grant had soon appointed the commanding general of the U.S. Army, couldn't believe the turn of events. Shortly after the inauguration, Sherman, who was stunned, expressed dismay and disbelief that his old commander apparently had altered his approach to and his understanding of American Indians and the administration of Indian affairs. Many people wondered if it was possible that of all people, the former commander of the U.S. Army might in fact shun the sword for compassionate methods to solve the so-called Indian question. Certainly his statement in his inaugural address seemed to affirm a conviction held at that point by only a minority of his fellow citizens. Indians were not vanishing vestiges of the Stone Age, not unregenerated savages, not unchangeable impediments to American pioneer progress, whose extinction was a tragic but inevitable fate. Perhaps Grant, in calling for proper treatment and the civilization and ultimate citizenship of the Indians, after all agreed with the reformers that with time and diligent effort, Native Americans could not just be, quote, civilized, but made citizens of the Republic. It was common knowledge that the reformers passionately believed that to civilize Native Americans was to safeguard them, not just from American aggression, but from what they considered the negative effects of Native culture. So the question was the federal government finally going to take a more humane direction in its dealing with Native Americans? Now, in 1869, based on the inaugural address, many reformers hoped that that would be the case. To his credit, Grant was willing to take a relatively open-minded position for that era regarding Native Americans, an open-mindedness shaped in no small measure by Ely Parker. Ely Parker was Grant's first Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and it's unquestionable that Parker's greatest effect on Grant was to strengthen his conviction that Native Americans could be civilized, and to fortify his faith in the possibility that Native Americans were capable of leading productive, modern lives in contemporary American society. That was a pretty progressive position to take in 1869. So let me tell you a little bit about Parker. Eli Samuel Parker was a Seneca Indian. His Seneca name was Hasanoanda. He grew up in Genesee County, Genesee County, is western New York State. With great difficulty, Parker had received a commission as captain of volunteers during the Civil War, and from there his military career advanced rapidly. Parker joined Grant's staff, General Grant's staff, in 1862, and served on his staff throughout the remainder of the Civil War, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Parker was actually among the intimate circle of trusted officers who accompanied Grant when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to him at Appomattox. In fact, Parker even wrote the final draft of the surrender terms that day. Also on that day, Parker was promoted to the rank of Brevet Brigadier General, becoming one of only 2 Native Americans to earn a general's rank during the Civil War. When Grant became president, he offered the job of Commissioner of Indian Affairs to Parker, and Parker became the first Native American to hold that job. He directed the Indian Bureau for 2 years, from 1869 to 1871, during which he backed all aspects of what became known as the Grant Peace Policy. The relationship between Parker and Grant is pretty interesting, and in a way probably critically important to understanding Grant. Parker probably, for Grant, sort of personified or stood in for this bigger idea of the place that Native Americans could hold in the United States. And the president, in his own way, really stood ready to help and support the struggle of ushering Indians from what he perceived, as did many Americans, from their old, dying, impractical lifestyle into the mainstream of America. But as we'll see, Grant's peace policy, as it's called, only went so far. The genesis of that policy really goes back to a meeting that he had with a delegation of Quakers a couple of months before the inauguration. He met with these Quakers in January of 1869, and they were one of the most active groups in this sort of emerging field of Indian humanitarian reform. They called on Grant, and they urged him to embrace an Indian policy grounded on the idea of Christian benevolence. His response to them was this: "Gentlemen, your advice is good. I accept it. If you can make Quakers out of the Indians, it will take the fight out of them. Let us have peace." Well, the delegation was jubilant. There had been these years of tortuous, really dreadful relations between Native Americans and the United States. And so here's this national war hero, the Republic's next president, promising that, in his words, all Indians disposed to peace will find the new policy a peace policy. But, as a sort of pragmatic afterthought, it's important to remember that Grant also said to the Quaker delegation, and here again I'm quoting, "Those Indians who do not accept this policy," meaning the peaceful concentration on the reservation, "will find the new administration ready for a sharp and severe war policy." Maybe the delegation was so exhilarated they failed to weigh this statement as carefully as other ones made that day. Perhaps their lack of apprehension at hearing words like sharp and severe war policy came from their confidence in the ability of humanitarians and the idea of Christian benevolence to solve problems of the world, and certainly to transform the hearts and ways of Native Americans. Then, shortly after Inauguration Day, a group of Christian reformers met in Philadelphia, and they all agreed there that they should continue to press their demands with the new president. So they appoint a delegation to travel to Washington and the delegation meets with President Grant and the Interior Secretary. I have to say, as an aside here, I think Grant's actually a really interesting historical figure. There's that story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, about Grant after the first day of battle in the Wilderness Campaign in the Civil War. In a war that's just unbelievably bloody and horrible, Grant loses over 17,000 men that first day. And the story goes that, well, there are two. One is that he returns to his tent and he throws himself face down on the cot and he weeps uncontrollably. There's another story of him sitting under a tree all through the night as the rain falls, listening to the groans and the cries of the dying men around him, and then telling an aide who asked him why he did that, something about, that he felt that it was such a horrible thing that he didn't have the right not to hear the anguished cries of his men. It's hard to say if those stories are apocryphal or not, but it does seem that that he was really a tortured man, and that though he was brilliant in war, after really a life, kind of a failed life, he never seemed to be very good at anything. He found his ability, and that was to wage war, but it seems to have haunted him. So I don't know how much that might play into the approach he took with Native American affairs, but nevertheless. So back to this delegation. So this delegation of men from Pennsylvania meet with the president, and they really stress the need to shift from military solutions to humane solutions. And in their minds, that means involving Christian people on the reservations. Their idea is to take Native Americans on reservations and involve them in these sort of life-changing transformations and lead them to these white people's vision of constructive lives. So one solution that they present to Grant is that the president give Protestant denominations a role in overseeing Indian Bureau policies. Another proposal that they have is that the government should use Christian missionaries as agents on the reservation, where the missionaries would work directly with tribal members. They also argued that this would end the often corrupt practices of the Indian service. So the president agrees with these ideas, and he proposes legislation to Congress. Congress also agrees that the concept was a good one. And in April of 1869, Congress passes legislation that authorizes the president to organize a board of commissioners, men, eminent for their intelligence and philanthropy, to serve as a sort of executive board of Indian commissioners. This new body would then exercise oversight in 3 areas: policy, finances, and personnel. The board would advise the Secretary of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So they would sort of serve as a body that helped form Indian policy, helped create reform initiatives, and finally serve as a watchdog over the disbursement of funds appropriated by Congress for Native Americans. I should point out that anti-Catholic sentiment was running very high at this time in the United States. So there were 10 appointments to the board, and they were all Protestant denominations. So Grant is involved in this effort to reform the Indian service. So the next thing he does is he begins to attack the political corruption in the Bureau, to end the widespread dishonesty and fraud, and to really create an honest and competent management system. His idea to do this is to take his army comrades and heavily involve the military in the operations of the Indian Service. So the message was pretty clear. Ulysses Grant, the old soldier, trusted the army far more than the political bosses or the bureaucrats or the politicians of Washington, D.C. Well, Congress was asked to approve two measures. First, Grant wanted Army officers appointed to civil posts in the Indian Service. And then the second thing he wanted goes back to the transfer issue that I mentioned earlier. He wanted the Indian Bureau transferred from the Interior Department and placed under the War Department. In his mind, in Grant's mind, these moves would strike at the heart of the old Indian system, the patronage prerogatives of the members of Congress. Well, his requests shocked and angered Congress. To Congress, allowing a greater role for Christian denominations in Indian affairs was non-threatening and completely acceptable. But to relinquish the sizable power from the lucrative spoils system was completely different. So Congress repudiates Grant's desires, and then they retaliate. They prohibit the appointment of Army officers to civil posts within the Indian Service, and they struck down yet another transfer bill. President Grant is then furious with the men on Capitol Hill, and he says to them, "Gentlemen, you have defeated my plan of Indian management, but you shall not succeed in your purpose, for I will divide these appointments up among the religious churches with which you dare not contend." And so at that point, Grant throws his support even more behind the Protestant denominations and the Christian humanitarian reformers. His idea was that they would control the jobs in the Indian Service, not Congress through patronage and the spoils system. Grant knew, he was a good enough politician to know, that Congress would no way attack the Christian churches as they had attacked him. By 1872, as he was nearing the end of his first term, 73 Indian agencies had been awarded to denominations. Christian men, hearing the call to the mission field, reported for duty, not to missions in Africa or Asia, but to Indian Bureau agencies on Native American reservations within their own country. Many of them worked with great concern to meet the spiritual needs of people living in a great state of despondency, consigned by the United States government to lives of emotional depression and physical poverty on the reservations. The missionaries, who were now Indian Service agents, often worked faithfully to mentor Indians toward what they saw as a, quote, healthy Christian civilization and a move towards intellectual and moral development in their minds. The last important piece of Grant's peace policy that you should keep in mind was a significant one, and that was terminating the use of treaties. It's at this point that the United States discontinues negotiating treaties with Native American tribes. Instead of a treaty between two autonomous nations, Grant sort of acknowledged that the use of treaties perpetuated a fiction. As one Episcopal bishop said, "We recognize a wandering tribe as an independent and sovereign nation. We send ambassadors to make a treaty as with our equals." He said, "It's impolitic for our government to treat a heathen community his words, living within our borders as an independent nation instead of regarding them as wards. And by an act of Congress in 1871, as you've read in the Iverson introduction, the United States government ends treaty making with Native American tribes. The federal government would no longer regard tribes and deal with them legally as sovereign political entities. After 1871, Native Americans were officially dealt with as wards of the United States government. So on the one hand, Grant's peace policy was progressive, certainly progressive for its time. On the other hand, it really, I think you can argue, deviated very little from the guidelines set by the concentration or the reservation policy of the post-Civil War period. Force should be employed and could be employed, but now only after peaceful means had failed. Ultimately, the Grant administration demanded the absolute concentration of Native Americans in reservations. The difference was that their missionaries of various Protestant Christian denominations could then labor at transforming people into, quote, Americans, culturally, spiritually, and economically. In other words, a religious-based, government-funded assimilation project. And hundreds of sincere, well-meaning individuals volunteered as missionaries for work in the Indian service, to serve people of various tribes on reservations. Grant had pledged that peace could indeed be secured by tribes as they made advancements, working with the missionaries and others, but only in this manner. Conversely, his administration, as he himself had promised, was fully prepared to employ the military to ensure that the Native Americans obeyed the first dictum absolutely. And that is, those who do not accept this policy of peaceful concentration on the reservation will find the new administration ready for a sharp and severe war policy. And as we know, the occasion to do so arose twice, as the Plains Wars would erupt again in the course of Grant's presidency. And those wars were decisive. The Red River War brought significant conflict on the southern plains to an end, while the Great Sioux War closed the belligerencies on the northern plains.